Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first panel discussion of the day. This is our educational technology panel, and I'm just going to start by introducing, or rather asking our panelists to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about what the things are that they've been working on most recently, what the priorities are for them before we go into the broader discussion. So, Anne, I'm going to start with you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Anne Northcliffe. I'm the head of the School of Engineering, Technology and Design at Canterbury Christ Church University. So some of the research areas that I've been working on with my computing students from my section is looking at the learning technology platforms like Zoom, Teams, Blackboard, Collaborate to identify sort of current research is understanding what is it we like from each of those platforms and what works for us, because as we've all learned this year, they're all different. Their all functionality is different, and also how they communicate the data is different, and which actually has a direct impact on the student's experience and how, whether they can actually connect, actually can use the mics and use the cameras. So I'm really interested in that space because actually there isn't even a collective name for these softwares at the moment. So, you know, out there's CMSs, CRMs. So I'm interested in a collective name to start with.
Okay, yeah.
And then really bottoming out back to the suppliers, what would work from a pedagogical learning point of view, because that's really missing at the moment. And the water has broken. So the students' expectations is that we should be still doing this a hybrid of using these technologies as well as face-to-face, because in reality, that's what's happening in the workplace. And it's happening in engineering, the best part of 20, 30 years for certain things like gas and oil industry. You don't actually stand outside your gas pipe or plant controlling it. You're 3 miles down the road. So it's imperative that actually we develop these skills in our students going forward. So we've got to find the right solutions and technology to support that from the pedagogical point, employability.
Thank you, Anne, and I'm sure we'll pick up the detail of some of that a little bit more in the course of the conversation. Good morning, Amy. Welcome. We're just doing introductions, and panel members are just setting out some of the key things that they've been working on recently before we go into the main discussion. So over to you, Amy.
Oh, so hello, good morning, everybody. I'm Amy Sampson, so I'm Head of Digital Learning at Falmouth University. Our challenges mainly have been around kind of our subject areas, so we're very creative arts based at Falmouth. A lot of assessment done on kind of tactile artefacts, and translating a lot of our teaching online has been quite difficult for a lot of our subject areas, but we relish a challenge, so it's been all right.
Yes, and in particular, it'd be interesting during the course of the discussion to get a sense of how kind of both colleagues and students in those discipline areas are finding kind of the digital solutions and whether they are working for them when they have those high expectations of using creative spaces on campus. And I think that's been one of the challenge, possibly one of the most challenged discipline areas over the past 18 months, hasn't it, really? Because they've probably been less able to come onto campus than other groups who would have PSRBs that would be part of the support network around making sure they get that campus experience. So that'll be interesting to see how you've been coping with those challenges. So thank you. Christopher.
Yeah, so Dr. Chris Weeks here. I'm the UK manager for Rapid MOOC. So we sell all-in-one green screen studio booths like this one. This is a small one, the Go. So for us, I think some of the biggest challenges we've seen, especially across our university clients, is one, the transition from sort of originally it was kind of the transition from let's put everything online because we have to how do we put stuff online now that's a kind of higher standard or higher quality level, and how do we sort of give that sort of professional and high quality feel for a sort of university course rather than traditional sort of laptop videos that sort of had to happen because of COVID. So I think there's kind of been that transition that we've seen quite quickly. I think helping a lot of our clients with the speed of transition, I think, has been the other one, where it's been, I'm sure you're aware that it sort of went from people talking about doing video and video content to, okay, we need to get everything online now as quickly as possible. And how do we do that at scale? I think is probably the second question that's been really interesting for us. When you've got, you want to be sort of producing sort of a whole series of content, maybe 100 videos in a month, with lots of different academics, students, different departments, and you've got lots of different people involved in that as well, from sort of learning design point of view, the pedagogy side, and how do you all do that in a kind of nice, refined way. That's kind of probably been the sort of biggest two areas we've seen change. And then I think the final one that's sort of coming a lot more now, I think this was mentioned a little bit in the opening ceremony, but was around community and student engagement, and how do you get students online involved a lot more. And that sort of, I think there's Dominic from Oxford claimed this, but I really like the phrase, everyone's on the front row, no one's in the corridors. So students are all on video, it feels like they're all on the front row of the classroom, but actually they're not talking in the corridors or doing that sort of informal learning, I guess. So how do you encourage a bit more of that through video content and a bit more sort of ephemeral content as well, I think is an area that we're seeing really interesting. And I guess the last one for us has been the transition from pre-recorded content to live streaming. I think that's been a big shift as well for us, from people using our studios, not just for pre-recorded content to do courses and online content, but actually live Zoom meets, YouTube Live, all these kind of other formats similar to this one where you're live streaming, that's becoming a lot more popular as well. There's some of the big trends that we're really seeing as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Cran. I'm sure that resonates with a lot of people who are here today in terms of some of the big changes that we've seen. Particularly, I think that shift from kind of post-class availability of digital learning resources to kind of pre-class availability. I think that's been a key shift, hasn't it? And finally, Stephen.
Hi, yeah, I'm Stephen Taylor. I'm Senior Learning Technologist for Blackpool and Fowler College. A lot of the stuff I've been doing at the moment is following on from what everybody else is doing, really. Now that staff are used to using online materials, we're starting to go down the data analysis route of things, making sure things are quality assured, using things like the Power Platform, Power BI, Power Automate from Microsoft to try and streamline some processes and to try and flag up where best practice is and maybe where best practice isn't, so then we can go and provide support in advance. I'm also starting to make that leap into VR, AR, because that's going to be a big thing in the next 5 years. So let's trying to just jump onto it in advance, ready for when students will be expecting it, because they'll see Facebook doing it, they'll see Teams doing it, and they'll wonder why they're not doing it. So we need to be ready for that space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. So I think for me, perhaps a nice opening question to all of you would just be around that kind of culture change that you've alluded to already, about the way in which we kind of putting our learning materials together and thinking about kind of the student experience, which, you know, prior to the pandemic, probably for most academics, especially those who were working on campus rather than in an online learning environment, would have been that sense very much of the autonomous academic kind of putting their own learning materials together, kind of, you know, their own module will be very much within their hands for the most part. Obviously, the pandemic has driven changes around that. How have you seen through your experiences that coming together of a greater partnership between learning technologists, learning designers and academics in response to the circumstances of the pandemic, to create that kind of sense of collaboration and community? Anne, would you like to start? Yeah.
So one of the first things, I mean, in actual fact, my team were the first, because we had COVID cases, we were off campus before everybody else. And the university rather went, well, if your team don't get to grips with it, there's no hope for the rest of the university, because we had the technologists in. So the computing staff were very proactive in getting to grips, of pulling apart Blackboard Collaborate, finding tools, looking at and using MS Teams, and we literally hit the floor running. But on the top of that, I was very quick to organise then staff development for the staff and bring in our education technologists who've been pushing themselves every day. And they came in and did a whole session with us of some tools they'd pulled in. Our library services were quick as well in responding to getting hold technologies, digital books, but digital packages that exist already for engineering, and we were able to pull them in so they work. Because this is some of the other challenges that we've all found, is if you're doing a live lecture and then playing a video in the session, it doesn't work. So it was a question then making sure, how do we get these packages to work within these systems, and finding workarounds and sharing it across the team. So the team has actually been quite very proactive. What's now been better is improving that quality. Now, it's interesting, Christopher mentioned about the corridor learning. And this is where my research has been going with the students, because the computing students are very good at tackling that problem and how they've been using technology. And this is where I've ended up in the space of understanding those different bits of technology. Is the students have been going away and setting up Slack group, Jitsi, Discord. So the corridor learning is still happening for computing students. So you do a breakout group, but they're not in your breakout group. They're in another bit of tech, and they send you a link, and you suddenly have to get used to another bit of tech. So that informal learning, computing students are already, you'll find in your institution, are already cracking and developing solutions to that to maintain that informal, semi-formal and creative space learning. And that's where I'm interested, is actually one of the projects at the moment is researching that with the students, because I know from past experience when smartphones first came in 2008, my research of smartphones, computing students grabbed them first and worked out how to use them pedagogically. And that has fed into an awful lot of people's thinking longer term. So actually, it's worth grabbing your tech team, your tech students, to sort of pull things out.
Yeah, and I think that kind of staff development training that you mentioned there has been key, hasn't it? And I think looking at where your kind of confident champions are, and then getting those to work with colleagues in other areas, has been a really important part of everything that's happened in the past year or so. So, you know, at Derby, one of the key things that we've had is really, as a consequence, a very kind of consistent application of kind of baseline standards about the way in which we're designing our digital learning materials now. And I think that those are things we were doing anyway, but I think the pace at which that's driven forward, I think that very much picks up on what you're saying there, Anne. Amy, obviously different discipline area. How's it been for you?
Interesting, lots to learn, a good period of reflection for us as practitioners in this area. I think Falmouth kind of was in I say fortunate position, but we were at the beginning of a digital transformation program at the university, which was rolling out kind of the Microsoft suite of tools, embedding teams, looking at our processes within departments, but also within professional services. And we just accelerated that. So it was a kind of 2-3 year program that we just started, that we essentially had to kind of condense down into like a couple of months, and teams I think we rolled out in a couple of days. But originally that was a longer time scale. So a lot of the staff were kind of already on that journey because they knew what we were wanting to do, albeit over a longer period of time, and it just accelerated that process. So we had the tools there, albeit kind of untested, and we didn't know what would happen, but we had to be, and the whole sector had to be very reactive very quickly. And then the next thing we kind of addressed was adapting our assessments, because a lot of our assessments that kind of alluded to were on the artifact, like the final piece, and that a lot of the time was a physical assessment in a room, looking at, you know, a piece of ceramics or something else. So we had to then review our assessment and what we were assessing, and a lot of it then changed to the, you know, the process of how that artifact was made, and that then meant we had to make sure our reflective tools were up to scratch. So we use a kind of microblogging WordPress site, like an internal journaling tools. We had to make sure that that was robust enough to handle the increased use, and then just review our tool set. So we brought in kind of Mural as a kind of visual collaboration tool, which we felt in our tool set was a piece that was missing, especially where real-time collaboration was concerned. I mean, we'd used things like Padlet before, but it wasn't quite up to scratch. So we brought that in. We kind of used ThingLink, Padlet, and just had a look at our tool set. And kind of coming back to what Anne was saying with students going off and doing their own things, we did have that with Discord. And yes, again, it was the game students who were doing that. But again, they've reflected back on that, saying now we actually have kind of too much communication, because we're still having to use Teams for certain things. We've got Discord coming in, and it's that I guess it's that personal academic space. There's a bit of blurred lines there. So I think, yeah, getting our tool set kind of defined and really supported, making sure we've kind of scaffolded training around that. We've been really fortunate with Mural that we've worked a lot with their education team, and we've rolled out kind of templates and stuff with them, which has been great. And now it's kind of that period of reflection, right? That's the last 18 months. What can we learn from that? Is there anything that we could be doing better? Because the staff are well aware they're on that journey with us. And it being kind of creative arts, you know, there's always kind of new tools coming out and new ways we can be using tools. So for us also, it's not looking at just kind of traditional educational tools, but looking at tools in the sector that students will be using it once they graduate and thinking, right, how can we incorporate that into the education they're doing now? So yeah, a great period of reflection and a brilliant opportunity. You know, like the pandemic has not been great at all for any of us, but I think it's really accelerated a lot of direction for the ed tech space in particular.
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, obviously we need some structure about what tools we use for different functions, but at the same time I think that sense of experimentation that you both commented on there so far, and the role that the students are playing in driving that, I think that's really important. And I think that's hopefully a real strength coming out of what's happened to these students over the past 18 months in the way that we shouldn't think of them having a deficit skill set. If anything, they seem to be more confident to experiment with digital technology, and I think that's ultimately what we want. We don't want them to be obsessed about a particular form of digital technology, because that might become obsolete in years to come. What we need is graduates who have that kind of sense of wanting to learn about things, experiment with things, be adaptable and resilient. And I think that's one of the things that I'm seeing from our student body here as well. Stephen, did you want to say a little bit about kind of the collaborative approaches to design at your institution?
So just before lockdown hit, we bought a completely new learning management system. So we were in the process of rolling out Canvas as lockdown 1 hit, which is as fun as you can think it possibly was, yeah. But that did leave us with a lot of freedom in how we helped direct staff. I think because we were having that already quite hands-on approach, we were already having large meetings with full departments. That's pretty much seamlessly moved back onto Teams for it. And we had the big recorded sessions, which staff found really useful because they could then go back and do it. We'd also launched quite a comprehensive staff digital training program in the January, just before lockdown hit. So obviously that also helped massively with things. We still did have the odd 1 or 2 members of staff. I remember on the day just before lockdown happened, I was asked to go and give some training to a member of staff who hadn't quite figured out that he wasn't going to be in a classroom doing his training, but he was going to have to be at home. And it did take a good half an hour to explain, no, you're not going to have that whiteboard behind you. You're going to be at home, so let's find ways around it. But everybody did just really grasp it and run with it and find new, some really interesting ways around. We have some lecturers who went full on using Unity and using Unreal to build 3D approximations of the tools that they would use in their lecture theatres, particularly in the maritime side of things, where they're used to having physical objects to represent ships, actually modelling that in sort of that video game space. So then students could still have that physical interaction with things. We've had people in catering who were doing follow the recipes and record yourself following it, using things like Flipgrid for it, so the students could do it in their own time. So when it was convenient for them, because obviously some students, being in Blackpool, a lot of students may not have that luxury that say you or I might have, of having a kitchen that we can just go in ourselves and do what we need. So giving them that extra time to, go and do it in your own pace, getting that flipped learning there has been so important with it all. But yeah, we've ended up using Microsoft products quite a lot. I don't know, the Microsoft Innovative Educator program has been really useful personally for me, because pretty much any question that I've been able to go either to that team or to Twitter or wherever, and get an answer relatively quickly. And one thing I did notice was communities of educators coming together and massively supporting each other throughout all of this. So you've got that Microsoft Innovative Educator Program. You've got Google for Education, which I've not been involved with, but I've seen loads of amazing things from. Apple Education. There's a thing called the DigiLearn sector that's run out of University of Central Lancashire, which is absolutely amazing. And even in the Canvas LMS, there's all sorts of stuff down that side of things as well, where teachers were just freely sharing their ideas, sharing their knowledge, which I think that's going to be a big takeaway from this. Previously, if you wanted to upskill yourself in Excel or something like that, you'd go and get a paid course somewhere. But now it's pretty much freely out there in social media if you know where to look and if you know who to ask. And I ended up being a millennial. I fell into the trap of TikTok during lockdown. And the sheer number of things in there that show you how to use Excel.
Yeah.
And just very quick, it blows my mind because most people think, oh, TikTok, that's just young girls dancing, isn't it? But no, there's loads of stuff about how you can use Excel, how you can use PowerPoint, how you can use various education products. Because Sarah's comment.
Well, other people are admitting to that, Stephen. So.
But yeah, it's just the level of collaboration that's come out across the entire teaching and education community is just astounding, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that absolutely is one of the key things, isn't it? And I think those different sources of knowledge now as well, I think you're a really important point that you raised there. I think obviously one of the big challenges we've faced over the past 18 months is that some of those traditional assessment approaches that we had were not going to work very well in a digital or remote environment. And so, Christopher, I wondered if there's anything in particular that you think you've noticed in terms of key technologies that have been helping to kind of transform digital approaches to assessment, and maybe in particular dealing with that challenge of moving us away from the old-fashioned examination.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one where I think from our side we've seen I think education technology accelerated really quickly. We're probably 5 years ahead of where we would have been, I think, without the pandemic, maybe a bit more actually. And I think it's gone from a should to when equation now. So when should we be doing this stuff? And I think especially around, you sort of mentioned examinations, I think the sort of standard examination process is starting to sort of feel a bit old-fashioned for a lot of students, I'd say, and feel a bit restrictive in terms of how they'd like to submit content and how they'd like to produce material. And I think that space is really opening up to be, I think video is obviously one platform that we're sort of working quite a lot with video assessments and video feedback. I think is another one that's sort of quite underrated sometimes. That's kind of, especially the ephemeral kind of feedback where a lecturer might do a class and they're going to give feedback for the whole class on 2 or 3 points. A short video is sometimes a bit quicker than an email with lots of content, or there might be actually an assessment. You might actually give exam feedback through video. And I think actually sort of moving a lot further forward than that, I think the kind of AR, VR space is going to become quite interesting, where you have like one-to-one feedback in VR and AR, and is there other ways of submitting content that isn't written, I think is the other one. So I even think around podcasts and audio. For some students, maybe an audio exam might be better than actually a video or written. As someone that's dyslexic, I wish I had this when I was younger, because being dyslexic, it was quite hard to do a lot of written exams, and I spent a lot of my time doing quite a lot of writing, especially doing a PhD, which was quite a lot of writing as well. I sometimes wonder, is there other formats for certain students that learn differently that could be a lot more accessible to people, I think, actually, where especially you've got people that are quite social rather than sort of people that want to sort of spend a lot of time writing. So I think we're not quite there yet with that kind of stuff yet. I think there's a lot of traditionalness around the exam process and the sort of way, and there's kind of like quite a lot of sort of traditional thinking, I think, still about the exam. Like people need to sit and they need to be assessed, and even like coursework, I think, is still taking a while to come through. That actually it's fine for people to submit lots of coursework over a year rather than just doing one big thing at the end. And I especially think can't remember who was talking about this, about industry versus university. And actually, when you're in industry, it's not often someone says you're going to spend 3 years doing something, and then at the end we're going to do loads of exams to test what you learned over those 3 years. It's much more granular and a lot more based on peer-reviewed one-to-one sessions, monthly goals, every 3 months, maybe a bigger goal and a yearly goal. And I think this kind of stuff, I think, would be really interesting to start bringing more of that into the academic side, especially as we transition to more remote. I think it's sort of blended learning starting to become more popular. I feel remote's not going to go away that much. I think students want that sort of balance. Some want to be on campus, some want to be, and I think the exam process has to start to mold to that as well. Be a lot more flexible and a lot more iterative, and have a big change there, I think. But I think that'll be the last bit to change out of the whole. I think the learning process can change quite quickly. I think the exam process will stick around for a little while, maybe on that one.
Yeah, I mean, so several things you pick up there around kind of inclusivity, and I think obviously some of the changes we've made about availability of materials beforehand for dyslexic students and students with other specialist needs as well, I think really important. But I think, yeah, key thing that you're saying there around kind of assessment is moving from exams to examining experiences and activities which have that authentic element to them and do link through to longer term kind of employability skills. And I certainly see Anne was nodding while you were talking, Anne, if you want to come in.
So for the last 20 years, computing has definitely moved away from exams because it's not pragmatic trying to examine computer programming, web application development, software. So most programs nationally have moved away in 100% coursework. Engineering, unfortunately, is still very wedded to exam because of their accrediting bodies. And it was interesting, we were having a conversation yesterday with the ICME about what are the things we would like to keep as a result of the pandemic. And one of them has to be the change in the examination process. We do 24-hour exams, but it's allowed us to create exams that are actually unique to each student. So you can do that electronic unique set of data. We can set more applied applications that requires that more criticality, analysis of design solutions that they need to work through and show and demonstrate they're applying that knowledge rather than that learning of knowledge and then constraining it to a very small applicational use in an exam, which is very time constrained, because in the commercial practice, that's not what they're going to do. All you end up is with students who come out on the exam process and the first or two are just very good at doing exams. They're not necessarily very good at being engineers. Yeah. And so the challenge we have now is convincing the accreditation bodies this is how we should be going. And their anxiety, they see it, they agree this actually is a positive way forward. What they want reassurance of finding a way, and from a pedagogical way, of checking that it's that individual student who has done that work in that 24 hours.
Yeah, I think the individual nature of the tasks that the students are set and how you design that is really key to that, isn't it? And then that sense of how it requires an application of knowledge that isn't Googleable, and then that gives that reassurance to the PSRB, doesn't it?
And also they haven't got a parent or an expert in the room while they're doing it. Yeah. And I don't particularly want to go down the route that University of Leicester's done with medicine, where the students were required to log in with 2 devices, one with a camera, watching them for the whole duration of the 4-6 hours of doing the exam. And there's some inclusivity issues with that. What I will say is that the 24 exams has enabled us to really think about creating inclusive exams. So it means no student gets extra time because they've all got extra time.
Yeah.
And we've even come up with solutions that they can do the exam twice. And because of the nature of the way the questions are presented or randomized, no student actually, when they do the exam twice, they're not getting the same thing the second time. So there's that cheating. So there is lots of solutions that we could be developing and now researching pedagogically. How sound is this? How is this moving us forward? And that adopting more assessment for learning approach, even within the exam process.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and it's not therefore just about the skills that they get from that and how we assure those skills, but I think in terms of student outcomes, I think we ought to start to see a reduction in some of those attainment gaps that I think, you know, all institutions continue to be concerned about. If you've got an inclusive approach, which is meaning people don't have to ask for assistance and kind of alternative ways of doing things, I think the fact that they're being built into what we're doing now is really important. Amy, in your area, assessment and digital solutions, how's that been moving things on?
So we don't have any exams at all. We're 100% coursework based, and we have been, just again because of the nature of our subjects just aren't suited to that. That does have its own difficulties on another side because of the size of some of the files that we're having to assess. So when you look at kind of architecture and their CAD files, and you've got music with kind of a lot of uncompressed audio files, it then becomes a bit of a bigger issue. And also being based in Cornwall, having a lot of rural students, there's a kind of bandwidth issue there in terms of how they're submitting and getting stuff to us. Also, you know, in terms of the technology that people have at home, that also provides limitations. And I kind of alluded to it with the having 2 devices. So we've got to understand that not everyone's on a level playing field when it comes to digital tools or digital connectivity. And we've been looking a lot of kind of around I think it's Daniel Stanford did the kind of bandwidth immediacy matrix, and what kind of things we're relying on to convey information to assess over the bandwidth that we have available. And so at Falmouth, we have challenges in what we want to assess and how we can technically achieve that. And we don't ever want to be in a position where the technology is dictating too much what we're assessing, but it's finding that balance of, you know, yes, it's great to assess that file, but how is that student going to get to us? We're obviously going to have to store it for a certain amount of time. And now we're kind of looking at, you know, the sustainability angle of that as well, and storing kind of gigs and gigs of data for the purpose of holding it because we've got a contractual obligation to. So it's a tricky balance, but ultimately we have to just keep coming back to like what the students trying to achieve, what we're trying to assess, and doing it in the best way. But I think where we don't have the difficulty with exams, it's that the file size, and a lot of looking at games software in particular, a lot of the VLE tools find it quite tricky when you're uploading different types of game files. You know, they kind of so it's finding ways around that. And I think if we're looking across the EdTech space, you know, innovations in that area, being able to kind of compress files better so that we can still assess them is a really interesting challenge. And I don't think the kind of traditional VLEs that we're using have got that. And even integrating things like SharePoint don't solve everything. So we're almost having to like look at different solutions for different departments just purely on the nature of what they're trying to assess. So yeah, different set of problems for us.
Yeah, not one size fits all solutions at all there, are they? And I think at the same time, though, I suppose in some of your assessments, are you finding that the students are now building a kind of a stronger digital portfolio as well as the physical portfolio that they would have used to have in many of your disciplines?
Yeah, 100%. And also because, you know, Falmouth's got a really high rate of self-employed students who come out and start their own businesses afterwards. So they're looking at a lot of the artifacts that they're assessing. They're going to take that as part of their portfolio. So we've also got an added element of anything they submit, they're going to want to keep and take with them to use to get a job. So it's yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and I think it's just being mindful of what's happening in industry and making sure that we're supporting those students to make sure they can go and get an amazing job with the work that they're submitting. So yeah, it's that balance of the relevant skills, isn't it? As we were saying a moment ago, the assurance of the professional knowledge and the academic knowledge and understanding, and how we design that in. And there's several people also agreeing in the chat, I think, and your points around proctoring. I think we'd all agree that there's not an ideal proctoring solution out there at the moment. They tend either to be, they don't really give you much assurance, or they're overly sensitive to all sorts of silly things, really. Just in the 5 minutes or so that we've got left, I just wondered if each of you wanted to just say a little bit about, you know, what the technologies that you think you're going to be kind of championing next, particularly from that perspective that Amy just drew attention to there. I think is really important in terms of, in the end, it's the learning and teaching requirements of the discipline that should be driving how the digital comes in, rather than the other way around. So perhaps, Stephen, if I go to you first.
So the next big technologies that we're going to be looking at are things built around AI, automation, and kind of building bespoke apps through things. That's the big thing that we're focusing on at the moment, making it all data driven. So if a student, for instance, has an assessment that's due on Friday, and from our logs and from our data, we can see they've not actually logged on to their learning environment since last Monday, it'll automatically ping emails to the different people that it needs to do, set up an in-person meeting with their tutor and all that, just completely automatically to try and provide them with that support. And then, as I said, VR, AR is going to be a big thing going forward. So it's trying to find out how we can make that accessible to our students at a reasonable cost. Because we've done a big survey of our students, and 10% of students don't have a laptop or a desktop. 1% of students don't even have internet at home. So particularly in Blackpool, we have this massive digital poverty. So it's finding the ways around that as well as new technology comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Challenging those assumptions about digital natives, which are exaggerated often, and also the idea you said that students have readily got access as well. We not long left, so I won't say too much. So I'll, Christopher, over to you for a quick word.
Yes, so I think I'd echo Stephen's comment a little bit. I think AI and data is something that's in industry is really big at the moment, and I think that coming to educational space is going to be quite a big game changer. I think I know a lot more of our clients are requesting a lot more data and access to data. I think there's still some of the traditional stuff that needs to be done quite well. Like I think some sort of universities getting a lot more. I think they're getting a lot more quicker here, but we're seeing a lot more sort of learning spaces being created, or creative spaces for teachers to create content, I guess. So content creation spaces that it happened in startup accelerators quite quickly, where they had like podcast rooms, studio spaces. I think that trend's still going to continue. I think AR and VR, yes, but I just think there's a lot of cost in content creation in those spaces, and I think they're going to still take quite a while. And as you say, the sort of access to the headsets and all that that needs to happen, I think, and also just the infrastructure required for that kind of content, I still think that's quite a way away. We do some stuff in AR, but not a lot. So I still think there's quite a bit of work to be done there. I think the last one, and this is kind of, I guess, why Facebook changed their name, and we've talked a bit about communities. I think that kind of online community piece still needs, I think Discord's very popular, it's very text-based. I think social media platforms like TikTok with video is really interesting, but like, what's next? And I think the transition from video and text to sort of more virtual sort of environments, I think is going to be the next big sort of interesting trend. Like when we start looking at what's coming out of gaming and transition that into the sort of education space. So cosmetics, virtual universities, all this kind of virtual campuses. We've been doing a lot of work with Verbula, who run free. We have a partnership with Verbula, and I think those kind of platforms where you have a 3D space that people can walk around in, they can go sit at a desk, they can work in a library, they can be in different rooms, and they can have meetings, but all virtually. I think that's going to be a big trend, and we're seeing it happen with corporates at the moment quite a lot, and a lot more of those products coming out, and I think the same will happen. Although it'd be sad because I quite like all the old universities and the campuses and the big buildings, so I don't want to get rid of those.
But certainly, I think you're right, definitely. And I think creating those risk-free virtual digital environments for experimentation as well. We have a minute left, Dan, if you want to just say a final thing from your perspective.
So I think one of the things I'd like to crack or understand is the comms. Students are stop emailing. If they find that the research I did last year is they're finding it's not responsive, they want a direct messaging service, but what? Because they aren't answering to their emails. So yes, talking about technology and analytics and reminding them about their assignment, it's pointless if it's an email because they're not going to pay attention to it.
Absolutely. I think that's where we see a proper generational divide between those of us who kind of still think emails is kind of the way to communicate and our students who tend increasingly not to. I think that's
so I think agree. Comms is something we really all need to be identifying what works.
I think that's a good point for us to end on. Really, I saw Amy nodding in agreement with that as well. So, there's a lot more we could have talked about there. So the time flew by. So I'm sorry, we'll have to bring this session to an end now as we move into our next session on building student equity. So thank you all very much. Thank you.
Cheers.